All right. I think we're live. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jillian Graber. I'm Executive Director for Technology. And I have here with us Kelsey Krepps. She is with the Sierra Club, and we're going to talk about how PA has no money to plug today in our Lunch and Learn. Thanks for joining us. And just a little bit about Kelsey. So Kelsey goes by she, her. She was born and raised in Northwest Pennsylvania, just outside of Titusville, the birthplace of the oil industry. Throughout her undergrad and graduate education, Kelsey focused on the environment and history of Pennsylvania and other parts of Appalachia. Knowing that understanding how we've gotten to where we are will play a key role in imagining and developing a sustainable fuel campaign that she's been working on since March of 2020. So she works with the Sierra Club. And Kelsey, I don't know if I have your title in here. What is your
Yeah, I am the senior campaign representative with the Beyond Dirty Fuels campaign at Sierra Club.
Excellent? Thank you. All right, and we are going to talk about this initiative that we have been working pretty closely on. The last, I don't know, has it been a year yet? I feel like it's been a really long time.
Almost. It has really, I feel like it's probably coming up there within the next few months for sure. And maybe even some pre-conversations before anything ever became official partner, work together for sure.
That's right. And we're going to try to move this around so you guys can see the slides that Kelsey put together. She took some time to get some visual aids here as we discuss this topic. And so if you have comments or questions, if you want to put them in the chat, go ahead and stick them in the chat as we move along. I'll be able to see them up on the screen and ask Kelsey your questions, and we'll be able to respond to those as we move along in our discussion. So first, we're going to talk about kind of the bonding petition and the process of proposing these rules. So I'm going to go ahead and take it away, Kelsey, and tell us a little bit about how we got here today.
Thanks so much, Jillian. I really appreciate it. One of the best ways for us to kind of start about how we got here with working on the bonding campaign is really actually understanding Pennsylvania's history. In Pennsylvania, we were the first to drill for oil back in 1859. And so for a really long time, we didn't have any environmental regulations or permits to do this. So up until like the mid 1900s, folks were just kind of drilling on their properties, drilling on what land they had, and there was no requirement to plug these wells once they were done with them. And there was no permit requirement to get before you could even drill the well. So we have a lot of legacy wells across the whole state that are just kind of sitting out there in our property, in our woods, in our public lands. And they've been there for a really long time in a lot of situations. And when they're left there that long without proper cleanup and without proper plugging, they can threaten our communities with methane emissions, and water impacts, as well as increasing our methane emissions for the climate crisis, and sometimes they can be explosive if they've been sitting long enough unattended. And so these things are, the legacy side of the issue that we're going to talk about, but it plays really well into the current wells that are in operation that we're going to kind of get into, that why we've done this bonding campaign work. But these are still really important to kind of set the stage, because we just already had so many of these wells, and so many of them that have no money to be taken care of, which is where we go into our next slide here.
Nice. And so I guess and we already do have one question in the chat. This is from Barbara. I read that PA Senator Yaw wants PA to pay for plugging wells. Can this be for real? So do you want to respond to that, or are we going to cover that in the
I can respond. There have been some recent initiatives coming from certain folks in our legislature who are concerned about this issue. And I think that particularly when it comes to plugging wells, it's a very bipartisan issue. This is just something that has been a problem for a really long time. We know it's been a problem for a really long time. And there have been initiatives to work on this to plug all these wells and find them through the Department of Environmental Protection. But you're seeing a more increased, I would say, perspective and make haste kind of conversation because of a slide that we'll talk about a little later, but it's the infrastructure plan money. So there is a lot of money that our state is being given for a federal well plugging program. And because of that, it's also being kind of, I would say, creating this catalyst for this particular issue of how we can potentially take care of it and who we can be employing to do that work and how quickly we could get it done. Just because it is an environmental steward issue and it has been for a really long time. It's been talked about for a really long time. And it's basically just like finally there is some momentum that's kind of kickstarting and rolling down the hill. And I think it'll just keep going like that.
Yeah. And so there's been a lot of behind the scenes work that you've been doing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, back to getting into some of this work is taking a look at what we would need to take care of some of these older wells. And that's a part of this program that was established underneath the Oil and Gas Act. So DEP does receive some money to take care of these old legacy wells is what I like to call them. But the problem is just the scale of which we have these legacy wells ranges from anywhere to 200,000 wells to 700,000 wells. And we don't know where all of them are located. We also don't have enough money through the programs established in this orphan well plugging program to take care of it properly. And we also don't have DEP staff and contracts and such like that to take care of those things properly and to the scale of which they need to get done. I really think scale is so important when it comes to thinking about like our old problems almost. Our legacy wells here that are just kind of like hidden in your backyards. Sometimes they're in streams, sometimes they're in trees, sometimes, they're in homes. It's just like they've almost just been such a problem for so long that no matter what we do, it will still take a number of years to take care of the full scope of the problem. And there's a lot of issues with plugging them as well. Just in general, like I said, they could be in streams. There's very specific equipment that is required to get to these well sites to clean them up, as well as really skilled workers who are needed for this kind of work. And sometimes it can just be a matter of like, this well is on a really steep hillside in the middle of this property. Like, how do you get these larger rigs to get to that site to then clean it up? Sometimes the materials in the well itself is old wood, and you have to kind of fish all that stuff out of there before you can actually do your concrete plugging. It's a process. Yeah. And so because of the time it takes, the scale of which it's our legacy problem here, as well as the underfundedness of this program, we get into just like it's not going to be taken care of until we get things like, in a future slide here, the infrastructure plan that takes a look at these, getting to the point of plugging older wells. But then we have to consider what's the issues with our current wells and our current wells that are operating, not just these legacy wells. And that's where we get into our bonding campaign work for sure.
Nice. And is that the next slide here?
I think the next slide actually might be more of the infrastructure. It's just a map, actually. So this is just a good map to kind of show folks where a lot of these known wells are kind of located. And it really just overlays with the environmental history of Pennsylvania and some of our especially our oil, as you can see, like the Titusville and northwestern area where I grew up is vastly covered by these dots.
And so
I just like to pull. Yep, go ahead.
If somebody wants to see this, how would they get this information?
They would go to the DEP website, and actually, Jillian, in this particular picture here, I've linked that particular location on the web. So if y'all wanted that information afterwards here, we could send around those links that are linked into this slide deck. But yeah, everything is linked.
And maybe Mary can actually grab that link from the slide deck and stick it in the chat. That way we can have it solidified. So when people are looking back at the video, they can click on that if they're interested in learning a little bit more.
For sure.
Awesome. So then, Mary, would you mind going to the next screen? Oh, here's, all right. Oh, that's great. Okay.
So, like I was saying real quick here, is just that we're getting money. And so there is this sort of snowballing down a hill effect here. The President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law brought a lot of money into a federal well plugging program. And that first phase includes a $25 million initial grant that all of the states who are applying for this are eligible for. The second phase was very specific to Pennsylvania, so PADEP had to send in some information related to the job losses during the pandemic, the number of documented orphan and oil and gas wells, which we still have a lot, but there was still a lot of those that we don't know where they are. So these are the documented ones that DEP does have. And then the estimated cleanup costs. And cleanup can range for these older wells just because it can take longer to get those materials out of the ground. You don't know how long it's going to take. But roughly, DEP had to give an estimate. And for the first year of this formula grant allocation, we can get up to $79 million, almost a little over $79 million. There is a third phase, which is also where this kind of comes into our work, that includes performance grants for states that improve their regulatory processes dealing with plugging and preventing wells from becoming abandoned, which is where we get into our bonding reform work. So would love to advance the slide here just so we can.
Yeah, so are you saying, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but are you saying that we could actually get more money if we do this work? Wow, so that sounds pretty beneficial, right?
Yes, it does. And it just so happens that we, our groups together, along with a few other great PA-based organizations, are working on that because it is not just sort of our legacy wells that are our problem. We're getting money to address those. There's also a third component of this infrastructure money that deals with our wells that are currently in operation. And I love that this particular slide here because we have probably around $6 billion when it comes to the amount of money that we need to be plugging all of our old legacy wells. That still doesn't account for probably the $6 billion that's left out of this $12.2 billion. And our state only has $47.2 million in bonding amounts, which is the money set aside by companies to plug a well at the end of their lifespan. So we only have 0.4 of the total amount of legacy well money that we need and the amount of money that we would need to close the wells that are currently in operation. So this is, I love this little bit of having 40 cents for a $100 bill. It just makes it a little bit more compact because my brain just can't work in billions and millions all the time. But at the same time, we don't have money. And we don't have enough money set aside for the wells that are currently in operation to be plugged for the exact amount of money that it takes to do that work. Which is, and we can get more money from the state from the bipartisan infrastructure plan in the future if some of those regulatory processes are taken a look at. And so that's what we've been working on, is kickstarting that process to almost have another wheel rolling or ball rolling down the hill simultaneously that we do for this plugging money that we're getting. I do have just a definition slide here just because not everyone is so into what oil and gas bonds means as I am. So in order to get a permit, the driller has to deposit an amount of money with the state or provide a contract with an insurance company so the state knows that there's enough money to cover the cost of closing a well at the end of its lifespan. And really this is kind of, in my mind, I think of it as a similar concept to if a renter has a security deposit. You would get that back potentially at the end of your stay in said renting location if you leave the apartment or whatever situation in good, standing. So this is, you put up a bond, And if you plug your well, you get that bond money back. And so if you don't have this kind of money set aside, what you're really asking for is for the state's taxpayers to sort of make up the difference. And that's really what we have going on right now. And that is completely unacceptable to us as taxpayers, that we are sort of the short-hand aspect of industry's bottom line. We are included.
Yeah, but we're taking all the risk, and we're taking all the environmental cleanup. I think we see this. I mean, can we kind of look back at some of the other things that have happened throughout the state of Pennsylvania, acid mine drainage and mining? How we still have the cleanup that can be done, and sometimes it can be done, and it takes enormous amounts of money to clean up the streams and creeks here in Pennsylvania. I mean, we have such wonderful, precious resources with this beautiful waterway that we have here in PA, and for it to be damaged in such a way where these mining companies now, looking back, they're not even here, So wouldn't this kind of be like preventing history from repeating itself by,
Oh, I love that. This is how, and I always, yes, absolutely, Jillian. This is exactly about having history not repeat itself. It's also exactly about leaving a different kind of legacy, which is how I always like to think about it too, since I always call these wells legacy wells from the older kind of time periods. But we also get into this exactly similarly to how mining situations worked, where when mining companies would put some of their lower producing assets into a subsidiary company, and then that company would go bankrupt. And then that meant that the state and also taxpayers were on the hook for cleaning up those mines in the situation and other areas of which that they had impacted. And we're on the hook for that because the company was no longer even a company. And we're seeing some of that in Pennsylvania as well. And this is sort of exactly what you're saying. We're just really just trying to not have the history repeat itself.
Yeah, and that's crazy. Oh, I just had a light bulb go off when you said that, because we're working around one community, and we were like, why is this like company, like there's like several different company names for this one company, and I was like, why is that? But I think that what you're saying might be the case here, that like these companies kind of want to shield themselves from their own responsibility of cleanup. Do you find that that's the case?
We find the case where it's companies that are not producing as well, or the wells that are not producing as well, or as much over time, are often put into some of the other subsidiary companies that we're talking about. And then, yes, we have seen issues of bankruptcy. We've seen issues of interesting acquisitions by certain companies. Interesting that they are purchasing wells that we would consider not as profitable, or then to kind of still have a massive amount of wells that are low producing, which is another interesting kind of angle to think about, because if you're not producing, what's the point of acquiring so many? And so there's always this kind of looming bankruptcy issue, and we have seen that happen. We have I can provide a couple of different resources after this to talk about those looming bankruptcies, essentially. This is just kind of how industry operates.
Yeah. That'd be great. And actually, we have some great conversations in our chat. So thank you guys for putting out this this conversation. I think it's great. Someone says yep, fossil fuel companies change names legally to inflate themselves in liability. They slip away, and the public is left to pay for the cleanup and suffer the health effects from the pollution. And then they just pop up again in another name. Yeah, I've definitely seen some of that happening. So thank you guys for chatting in the chat, and let us know if you have any questions for Kelsey. All right, do we want to move on to the next slide?
That would be lovely, yeah. And this is where we really get into some of our work with dealing with some of the ways that we're hoping history doesn't repeat itself. And so we've taken a look at the bond amounts of this state. So that money that companies have to set aside to say that this is the money that they have to plug those wells at the end of their lifespan. And they are ridiculously low. They do not cover sort of some of the actual costs of what it takes to plug those wells. And so if you think about that, the difference to be made up is always the taxpayer, is always the landowners, is always the state. And so this process got started back when I first came on to Sierra Club in the summer of 2020, which actually my anniversary, I think, is coming up in the next month. But in that summer, our Dirty Fuels and our legal teams talked internally about pathways to raising oil and gas bonds in Pennsylvania, since we're so underbonded. Back in December, we realized that in order to come up with a best bond amount to request, we had to kind of know what it's going to take to plug these wells. And those vary based off of how old the well is, how deep the well is, how well intact some of those even equipment pieces are. Because even though some of the wells in operation today are newer, frac wells that we would kind of consider, there are still conventional shallow gas wells that have been around since the 70s. And so what kind of condition those are in can really play into how much money it's going to take to clean them up. So we actually commissioned an expert report from Dr. Jeremy Weber at the University of Pittsburgh, whose report outlined sort of what we could be asking for, the appropriate amounts for basically looking at contract sizes, looking at previous DEP data, looking at other data, to kind of come up with some key recommendations for ways that we could address the bonding issues in the state of Pennsylvania. And we took those recommendations and wrote, Ankit, Jain, our associate attorney, wrote and worked to write 2 different rulemaking petitions, one for unconventional oil and gas wells and one for unconventional gas wells and one for conventional oil and gas wells. So this would address both those fracking and shallow gas wells that I just referred to. And that was done last May, which is probably when we had conversations about with certain partner organizations who've been doing this work, who are concerned about this issue, both from a legacy well perspective and from a, the taxpayers, the state, and landowners are on the hook for all of this because we're so in the red when it comes to the bottom line of what's covered already.
Yeah, this is really helpful too, to learn the process of what you guys did to get to where we are right now. And I think it's important to note that it's a report, and that these recommendations were covered by an expert. They were this whole process was examined and analyzed to come up with the petition. And Ankit, I think he did such a great job of writing that up. Just such an awesome resource to have. So tell us a little bit about the bonding campaign launch.
Yeah, sure. So after the petitions were written and we consulted with a few partner groups like yourself and some other attorneys in the situation, we asked some folks to join with us on a petition filing. And we filed these 2 rulemaking petitions back in September, which it does say September 14th here. And 2 months later, at the November Environmental Quality Board meeting, these petitions were brought up for a vote by the Environmental Quality Board after a presentation by the Oil and Gas Department and Ankit and myself. And they passed in that November meeting, which is great. But what that means is they go back to DEP for study. And that study is where we would see reports based off of the recommendations that we had written in these rulemaking petitions. And those recommendations were to raise bond amounts to a couple of different numbers, one for unconventional, one for conventional wells, to take the blanket bond account amounts that we have. So sometimes the company, if they spend up to a certain amount, there's a threshold that they don't have to pay anymore per well. So it's kind of like if I had, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Essentially, if my threshold was $10, but I had three more things that cost $5, I wouldn't pay over that. I would only pay that 10. And I know that that's not a great example there, but at the same time, it basically just means that the more wells you drill, the lower the bonds that you have for all of the wells that you have. It's not a well by well situation, which is what we've asked for in those two petitions. We've asked that the blanket bond amount for companies reflects the per well bond amount, per well bond that it would take to cover that. We've also asked that these go retroactive. The problem is we have all these wells in operation and they don't have enough bonds to be covered by the end of their lifespan. And so we've asked for those bond amounts to be changed retroactively for the wells that are in operation today. And the fourth component of that is to have DEP and require DEP to take a look at bond amounts every few years to make sure that the bond amounts reflect what it is, the actual costs of plugging those wells, and what it would actually take. So that's what's the basics of both petitions. It's just a separation of those for conventional and unconventional. And what we're waiting on right now, if we go to the next slide, is really that key decision and reports from DEP taking a look at what those petitions included and what recommendations they make based off of those petitions. So we filed the petition. We had 30 to 60 days to hear back before it would go to an EQB meeting. And then it did in November, and EQB makes a vote to accept the petitions for further study. That happened, which was great. DEP has a non-binding 60 days to have those petitions for study, and before they have to give us a update on where those petitions sit. We actually got a little bit of an update this morning at the Environmental Quality Board meeting at 9 a.m. Basically, DEP just said that they need more time to produce some rigorous reports based off of the information that we provided in those petitions. And so we would get another update at the March Environmental Quality Board meeting. If, based off of those petitions and the recommendations that are in those petitions, those are accepted and DEP makes a recommendation that we should start a rulemaking process to raise bond amounts, it would go into DEP drafting rules to raise bond amounts and kind of kickstart a rulemaking process like we've seen with the Pennsylvania methane bill, as well as even RGGI. So this would start going into a rulemaking process, and that would be a longer time period, but we'd have so many opportunities for all of our really concerned members and supporters who are wanting this issue to be taken care of, to get some comment periods in, to do some great event workshops and things of that nature. But there would be multiple opportunities for us to comment, including if what comes out of those recommendations isn't what we fully asked for. So we'd have opportunities to comment if they aren't as strong as we'd like them to be as well.
And we have a question.
Yeah.
There should be a simplified assessment for all fossil fuel companies to fund cleanup for the abandoned wells as a condition for being allowed to continue operation. Is this something that can be pursued? So that's an interesting question. Do you...
I'm starting to read it. I apologize.
That's okay.
I've lost it. There should be a super fun type of new legal required assessment for all fossil fuel companies to fund cleanup for the abandoned wells. Oh. I mean, there's a lot of angles that could be pursued within the rulemaking and any comment periods. I think with this one, I just don't know enough information about just how Superfund sites operate for me to make a good comment here. But at the same time, what I can say is, it isn't our responsibilities as taxpayers to be kind of cleaning up the wells that are in current operation today. We should not be a part of business's bottom line, and those costs should not be socialized through the state as far as I am who makes up the difference in this bond amount versus what it actually takes to plug your well at the end of its lifetime. There's a difference of money there. And I don't think that companies who are not in good standing in terms of financially either should be kind of, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. Companies who are not in good financial standing are not going to want us to raise bond amounts retroactively or currently. And that is because we've already been a part of their bottom line. So again, we are just we're really who is on the hook for a lot of this.
And I guess one question that I have is, so why don't we, why can't we depend on our legislature to do this work? I mean, it seems like something that should have been done a long time ago.
I can speak to it a little bit. There have been a couple of different attempts and bills produced over the last couple of decades that would have attempted to raise bond amounts. But the legislature has rejected them and sometimes rolled back the regulations to a previous existing bond amount in certain situations. And so it's just sort of been met with, this is not the move that we are going to make. So this is sort of the other reason why we pursued a rulemaking petition rather than worked with the legislature on some of this. Just there's precedent for them to roll back any sort of movement that we've seen to raise bond amounts in the state. And that's happened on multiple occasions over the last couple of decades.
It just seems to me that if a legislator is being fiscally responsible and conservative with their with the money that us as taxpayers pay to the state, that they would want something like this put in place, that they would want some type of bonding in place. That way, the onus is on the industry and a specific company that's doing that business, and not on the taxpayers themselves. So, do you think that maybe the legislators that are kind of working against this are maybe not doing what's in the best interest of the constituents of Pennsylvania?
I think for this particular issue, I have seen sort of bond amounts being talked about, but never when it comes to oil and gas bonds being raised. So I do think that this is an issue that's a side conversation that is of concern. I just don't think it's being looked at in the same way when it comes to an industry that we already have in operation and has been here for a really long time and has the precedent of we have precedent in the state of companies abandoning their wells, and we have precedent in the state of these low bond amounts being talked about for a really long time. I think it's just a matter of, this seems to be like the perfect and prime opportunity for us to not only talk about money for getting these well plugging programs from the infrastructure plan, but getting more of it because we're taking the responsibility and the regulatory processes to address the bond amounts as well. So I think that that's just sort of, I think if I think when you're kind of considering the fiscal responsibility as well, like that is blatant that this is not a fiscally responsible model to be operating from, except for if you're a company who would like to eventually go out of business and abandon all of your wells to the state. So at the same time, we don't want that to happen, but at the same time, we do have to have the accountability measures and the financial assurances in place that says they can't do that, and they will be liable for some of those responsibilities and needs at the end of their lifetime. So I think personally, it's just a really good timing to start talking about these issues again, even if there has been a precedent of them being rolled back in the past. I think it's prime opportunity to change sort of that history as well.
Yeah. I think and the big takeaway for me is that just because you've done something wrong in the past doesn't mean you have to, and there's precedent for that, doesn't mean you have to do it going forward. You can change that. You can change the way that things have been. If that system is messed up, you can change it. You can be the one to do it. So it's exciting that you guys are doing this work, and I'm excited that we're a part of it, because we've been in contact with you guys and really a part of this process, for like, I don't know, since we started talking about filing the petition, which is really exciting. So the DEP needs a little bit more time, they said. Okay, so March, let's say March comes around. What's going to happen then in March? Hopefully they'll make some type of decision, right?
Hopefully. We did hear from a later conversation, there was a question after our update was given about when the prospective timeline for these reports was going to potentially come out. And they did say late spring, early summer. So that does push us back even further from March. So our update in March could be that they need more time at the same time. we will be starting to put some pressure just because this is a really salient issue. It's great to take a look at this now to be prepared for things like the third phase of the infrastructure plan money. It's also just an issue that's not going to fix itself. It's something that we've been dealing with for a really long time. It's only going to get worse. As we, continue to have wells under bonded in the state and we don't have enough money to take care of them. And we already have all these legacy wells that are causing a lot of havoc in their own ways. So we're just trying to make sure that we're not adding to that backlog of abandoned wells and orphan wells that we already have. I think, we could hear another update that it could take more time, which is totally truthful. But we are starting to put some pressure in terms of getting these out soon is very advantageous for just taking and addressing this issue. It's been far too long, and it will, personally more salient, like I said, to look at this issue now. Similar to how the DEP was taking a look at the issues of abandoned wells and orphan wells long before we ever were guaranteed some of this infrastructure plan money. That was a preparation that took over, over the last year. And so if they're taking a look at this issue now, producing these reports and understanding that we could be moving into a rulemaking process now and this faster, then it would be perfectly advantageous to be doing that at this time.
Yeah, it sounds like a no-brainer. And so I hope that the DEP really, or the EQB really makes those moves that they need to make and do that evaluation and make it a priority. But what can everyday residents, everyday constituents in Pennsylvania, what can they do to take action on this?
To start, I think the very next slide is a letter to the editor workshop that we have coming up for this particular issue. And I can drop the link to that in the comments here if that would be helpful. If I just do that right here in the comment section, or am I not allowed to do that?
So if you do that, you can do that in the comment section, or if you chat it to Mary, she can go ahead and add it to the comments.
Perfect. I can do that really quick right now.
And while you're doing that, we have a question. Do you have any information about the negative health effects of orphan and abandoned wells?
Yeah, I do. So that actually is a really amazing cue, if I'm being honest, for the following slide that I have here. And it also cues up, I think, the next Lunch and Learn conversation, which is another one of our bonding partners in this bonding campaign, which is Earthworks. So I have here sort of some of the bigger issues when it comes to abandoned and orphan wells. Leaking methane, which is more potent than carbon dioxide in driving our climate crisis, your oil, your brine, your gas leak into surface and other waters. They decrease property values, and it costs fall to us. But the health effects of this would be a part of some of this leaking methane, some of this oil and brine and gas leakage to your particular water supplies. And they can cause a variety of health problems. And I don't have all of that information listed here in front of me. I know I have that information. At the same time, I think that cues up y'all's next conversation in terms of talking with Earthworks and talking about making these methane leaks coming out of these legacy wells visible to our eyes, because that is something that is incredibly important when we consider, who lives close to these. And Jillian, I think you could probably speak to this as well, given, some of the reports and studies that you've been a part of living close to these older wells.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we went out with Earthworks, holy cow, when you were talking about the just like where some of these wells are, we could not get to some of the wells to see like if they were leaking, which was crazy. I mean, I had never actually looked at a map to see where all the wells around me are. And so when we did that and then we went to the location, like it's one thing to see it on a map and see where it is and think, oh, that's up the street from my house. But then getting there sometimes is a whole nother matter, because like some of the wells were literally down in this ravine And I just thought to myself, why is it there in the first place? What led to them putting this well in this ravine where like you can't even get to maintain it? No wonder it's leaking. No wonder causing pollution. So I think you're muted, Kelsey.
Thanks for that. Sorry, I was like, even in the last House ERE meeting last Monday, there were some pictures that were being shown on the screen from a conventional operator up in the Northwest who has these wells with like trees growing in them. They have there's some right in the streams, like I said. There's some that are on hillsides that are so totally inaccessible now. And some of these legacy wells are just like, it's kind of gives me fine vibes of like a post-apocalyptic world where nature has taken back over. Because that's what this is we are seeing these pieces of gas infrastructure and oil infrastructure sort of being taken over after a long time. And because we didn't have a registration process for these things, because we didn't have a plugging, we do just kind of stumble upon them at times. And that can be pretty dangerous. There's been cases of like giant sinkholes kind of opening up where some of these wells have happened. Obviously, you're saying too, like the leakage of some of this into pristine waterways and pristine well water can also be extremely damaging to your pocket if your well water is damaged from a well that's close by to you. At the same time, you sometimes just can't get to them. Like the bottom of the ravine is not an easy place. The middle of a stream bed is not an easy place, but nature has kind of just grown over some of these wells that have been around for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, we have another question. We've got some great conversation going in the chat. Thanks, everyone, for keeping that up. Our question is, doesn't some radon radioactive gas leak out too? So does that happen in these old orphaned and abandoned wells? Do you know, Kelsey?
Radon is something that comes out of the ground like naturally, and so I wouldn't be surprised. At the same time, I do have more of like the official studies that kind of would go into the full breadth of what is coming out of the ground here. And I would say, yeah, it's not just methane. I just also always love to talk about methane because of its particular heightened contribution to the climate crisis. And we know it's much more of the greenhouse gas that we need to take care of immediately and have to start addressing much sooner and faster in order to deal with and abate and to take care of some of the latest urgency of which we need to be dealing with it related to the climate crisis. I do have the IPCC climate report linked in here as well, which basically says that, if we don't take care of our methane emissions, we will not be stopping some of the worst aspects of the climate crisis. And we need to be doing as much as we can.
Nice. And Mary, maybe you can put that report in the chat. If folks are concerned about radon, we actually, if you live in this area, Westmoreland or Allegheny County, or sometimes we can go a little further out, but we actually have a radon monitoring program for the home that's free, and people can sign up for radon monitoring in their home. Sometimes, when you buy a house, they actually come and do radon monitoring. However, we found that that's a really small snapshot and doesn't sometimes accurately indicate how much radon is in your home. So we always encourage folks to get a radon test, and you can learn more about that. I'm sure Mary could also put that link in the chat. We have a radon page on our webpage, and folks can sign up for free radon testing right there if they're interested. So I guess the next slide is just about any questions, which I think along the way we've gotten some really great questions. So thanks everyone for putting in the questions in the chat. And I've had them up on the screen kind of intermittently. And then next time, so we'll let people get another minute for some questions here. And then so I guess we could talk about what's next. So it sounds like there are upcoming workshops and opportunities for people to get involved. We had put the link to that in the chat. So a letter to the editor workshop is coming up very soon. And then we're planning some outings. I believe we're going to have one in area, and then one near where you're from, Kelsey, right?
Yeah, I'm really, really hoping to get some of those scheduled soon because I'm so excited. So this is actually a picture too from Oil Creek State Park, and so that's close to where I grew up. Like I said, I'm from outside of Titusville, but Oil Creek State Park is the birthplace of the oil industry. It also is featured heavily on the DEP map of abandoned and orphan wells because there's just so many of them in this particular park that have been plugged and taken care of over the years. So it's a really lovely location to kind of perfectly explain some of the historical issues. I also will just put a shameless bit in there. It's also got a lot of family history too. I had a grandfather who passed away a couple of years ago, but he used to bike a 10-mile bike ride through Oil Creek State Park every day. And he would ride 5 miles down to one pavilion, have an apple, and ride the 5 miles back. And we have a little plaque actually for him at that pavilion that says Ernie's Halfway Spot. So it's a place that's near and dear to my heart. My 8th grade field trip was there from one of my schools, or not one of my schools, but from my, grade school stuff. And so just a lot of history up there. And I just think it perfectly plays into knowing what our history is and being able to move forward into ways that are still also better for our environment and better for our health and better for our state. So I am hoping to do some outings up there. I'm also hoping to do some outings, like you said, close to us, over sort of like in Westmoreland, Allegheny lines, convergence areas. And I would love to, so there will be more information on those coming up. We will be doing those probably May through the summer into October. So if anybody wants to kind of keep an eye on that, I can say that there will be some more information on Sierra Club's website, and we'll probably do some emails that you'll see kind of coming out from that as well. But I'm really excited to do a partner event because I think it's playing so much into that you can just find some of these wells and be looking at them, and you can I love that Melissa from Earthworks has also been interested in these events, and so being able to take Melissa with us to make some of the methane coming out of these wells visible is amazing. I also just love that because it plays into some of my undergraduate work. I got to see Dr. Kang, who did some of the amazing research on some of how much emissions are actually coming from these abandoned and orphan wells, which is a large number when you consider that they're just sitting there no one's taking care of them. We don't have owners for a lot of these legacy wells. And so, I love like all of the mini connections of Northwest PA to this work, to this particular issue that we're taking a look at with bonding. And if we raise bond amounts, the likelihood that companies will do more of the actual plugging themselves and not be relying on taxpayers and the state to do that work for them. So
yeah, that'd be great. And so I want to mention too, Kelsey just mentioned this, so next month we are going to have Melissa Ossoff from Earthworks. She is the Pennsylvania field advocate, and we went out with her a couple months ago to check out some of the infrastructure in our area, and we found some stuff that was leaking and got some footage. So we're going to definitely share that with you next month. So join us March 29th. We actually moved this broadcast up a little. I think it was like a week early because there's stuff going on next week. But so this one's a little early, but it's normally our Lunch and Learn's normally the last Tuesday of the month. So every month, come back here at noon on the last Tuesday to learn more about different issues. It's great that this next issue actually connects with the one that we're talking about right now. And we are all booked up until I think June or July with some really wonderful content. So it's exciting to think about the fact that we can partner with organizations like Sierra Club and and Earthworks, and we can get this work done. It's exciting that this petition, this process is moving along. We really, really hope that it continues to move along with the DEP. And so, we can keep encouraging them to do so by writing letters to the editor and being a part of the outings and really following up with organizations like Sierra Club and like Protect PT. So join our email lists. That way you have all the up-to-date information on how you can really participate and make sure that our DEP follows through, that the EQB follows through on this wonderful work that Kelsey and her team has been doing for a while now. Do we have any last thoughts? Mary, would you mind going to the next screen, which is the last screen? Any last thoughts, Kelsey, before we hop off today?
I just want to say thank you for the incredible work that y'all do in these lunch and learns and also everything else that you work on. I love mentioning partners because I really think that there are so many of us, even in this bonding campaign, who are doing such great work that I'm so incredibly lucky to be working with folks and to be doing some of this with y'all. So like I said, just really grateful to be here. And if anybody has any questions for me, my email is kelsey.krepps@sierraclub.org. So feel free to follow up with questions and anything else that y'all might want to be involved with the bonding campaign.
Yeah. And if you want to sign up for future lunch and learns, all you have to do is subscribe on YouTube and it will tell you when our lunch and learns come up. It'll tell you when we've had another one scheduled. So please do that. And we want to make sure that we bring content and partners that y'all want to hear and want to learn more information about. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to take our survey, it's protectpt.info at lunch survey, and take a survey and tell us who you want to see, what kind of information you'd like to learn in your lunch hour, because we know your time is super valuable, and we want to give you the education and information that you need to help us and help folks like Sierra Club with the environmental stewardship and hopefully make our state so much better, make our state so much more livable. So thank you, Kelsey, for joining us today. It's been really so wonderful working with you, and thank you so much for all the support you guys have given us, and we're excited to move forward and learn more about the bonding petitions and everything from Sierra Club and from Protect PT. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks again for having me.
Bye, Kelsey. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.